My name is Manuel Roman Lacayo. I am the acting director for the Center for Latin American Studies at the University of Pittsburgh. Welcome. Thank you for joining us for the Charlemos event today. It is a special edition that will focus on the volume by America Latina Hoy that focuses on Venezuela. The title of today's Charlemos is Venezuela, Political Conflict and Economic Collapse. Benedicte Bull will be the moderator. I might also remind you about Charlemos, which is a collaboration between the Center for Latin American Studies and the Political Institutions and Processes section of the Latin American Studies Association. I will hand this over to Benedicte. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me to moderate this very interesting session on Venezuela, political conflict and economic collapse. I would like to start by congratulating the authors, the editors and the authors of this special issue, a very interesting collection of articles that I recommend everybody to look at. And it gives us an excellent opportunity to discuss Venezuela at the decisive moment in its history. I do have to say that I feel I've said that before. It appears always to be a decisive moment in Venezuela's history. We have with us two of the authors and editors, and also the editor of the journal. I would like to, I think this actually gives us a good opportunity to discuss a lot of different things. So I would like to make this both a discussion of the content of this journal, of how academic research can actually contribute to the debate about Venezuela today, also a little bit about the current situation and what we can expect in the future. That is a lot of things to discuss in a very short time. So I'll try to be efficient in my moderation. So our panelists today are María Ángeles Huete, who is the editor of the journal America Latina Hoy. She is a professor of sociology at Universidad Pablo de Olavide in Sevilla. And she's also the head of the research group on urban and metropolitan studies. She will present an overview over this special issue. Then we have Susanne Gratius, who is a professor of international relations at the law faculty of the Autonomous University of Madrid. And she's also a researcher at CIDOB in Barcelona. And she's the author in this journal of an interesting article on sanctions, European sanctions and US sanctions towards Venezuela, jointly with Ana Yusu of CIDOB, who's not participating today. And then we have José Manuel Puente, who is a professor of economics of the Centro de Políticas Públicas at the Instituto de Estudios Superiores de Administración, better known as IESA, in Caracas, in Venezuela, and is also a visiting scholar at Oxford and Salamanca and in Madrid. With that, I will give the word directly to María Ángeles, please.
Thank you very much, Benedicte. Okay. Good afternoon, good evening. I am María Ángeles Huete, editor of America Latina Hoy, of the Latin American Studies Institute at the University of Salamanca, and professor at Pablo de Olavide University in Seville. On behalf of the Institute and its director, Francisco Sánchez, I would like to thank to the Center of Latin American Studies at the University of Pittsburgh, especially Scott Morgenstein, a good friend of the Institute and a member of the scientific board of the journal, and also the colleagues from the LAPIS section of the LASA who participate in this initiative. For those who don't know us, America Latina Hoy is an area studies journal published in public access for almost 13 years by Latin American Studies Institute and University of Salamanca editions. This journal is one of the hallmarks of the Institute, together with the other publication, Latin American Journal of Public Opinion. America Latina Hoy is published 3 times a year, but we have implemented the first view system to make visible papers that are ready for the volume, but before the publication of the volume, and this is the way we can avoid long waits. The journal is characterized by publishing in Spanish, but we also receive manuscripts in Portuguese and English. On the screen, you can see our website where you can also consult all previous issues. Thanks to the authors, to Benedicte for coordinating and moderating the event, and to Susana and José Manuel too. I also would like to use my time to thank above all the reviewers, these generous colleagues who share their knowledge to the authors, and without him, the journal wouldn't work, this work and any other. In this case, in addition, they adjusted the time, the revision times, and allowed the journal to be published on time. You know that time for publishing is increasingly affecting journals, and one of the priorities of the review is to avoid it, or at least to reduce the time as much as we can. We are a journal made by academics, and we understand that the importance of having agility in the publication of our colleagues' works, and also without losing quality. This volume is a good example because you can check it in the dates of submission and publication of the papers. So we are very happy to be here today presenting this volume dedicated to Venezuela, a volume that is relevant in academical terms and makes an interesting contribution to the current debate on the country, although, as Benedicte said, sometimes is difficult due to the changing dynamics of the case. As you can see in the screen, the volume has 5 papers that covers economical, political, and international aspects of the process, without neglecting other aspects like migration that will be discussed in the next minutes. And to finish, I would like to remind the other people who make the review possible, the scientific and editorial board, and above all, thank you to the work of the Secretary of the Editorial Board, Asbel Boyes, that ensures the manuscripts are published with the highest quality and in the shortest possible time. And to everyone connected today, thank you very much for joining us. And the time is yours. Susana, thank you.
Thank you very much, Marianne. Susanna, I would like to hear from you both a little bit about kind of your thinking behind this special issue. I know from experience that there's a lot of challenges in actually putting together a publication about such a moving target as a lot of the issues related to Venezuela today are. And also, of course, here's something about your very fascinating article on sanctions. Please, Susanna.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much to the University of Pittsburgh, to the editors, to Francisco and Lassa, who made possible this short event, very short, so I have very little time to speak. So first of all, I think the good news was that we were on time. No? We delivered on time. And you said August, and we finished in August. That was wonderful, really. And a little bit to explain how we did this and why we did this volume together. We started our collaboration, José Manuel and myself, at the NASA Congress in Puerto Rico at some point, and then we worked together for several years. And we did a small piece for Foreign Affairs Latin America on Venezuela, combining that's always interesting, you know, the political science or international relations perspective with the economical. And this came out in exactly like 3 months after the Juan Guaido was self-appointed or appointed as interim president. No? And this was my thought, and I thought it would be nice to present something in Spain, and so we did. No? So we worked together in this issue, and I remember that first of all we had like 14 articles. So then we eliminated some of them, and then the reviewers eliminated another series of articles. So now we have like kind of 5 articles. In the main as the main issue, and then we have also this article by Armando Chaguacera comparing Nicaragua and Venezuela, more a historical perspective of elections, from former elections. now that's true, that Venezuela is a very moving target. So I decided with Ana Ayuso to write about the sanctions issue, which I found really fascinating, because there's not so much said about sanctions. And we, since we always work together, Ana Ayuso and myself, on EU-US sanctions, we try to compare these two policies towards Venezuela. And the simple question of our article is that how similar are EU and US policies towards Venezuela? And also a second question would be, did smart sanctions in combination with diplomatic measures really work better than US classical standard economic sanctions? And our finding, I mean, the most surprising thing in our article is maybe that it's not so surprising, but we compared both politics, and then we came to the conclusion that they are really very, very similar, because regime change is also indirectly a goal of the European Union. And that's not said in any official document, but if you look at their policy, it's very, very similar to the US. But it's small, it's not general sanctions that the EU applies, but they are selective sanctions against individuals. This is the big difference, which is not a surprise either. But when we compared EU and US policies, we also discovered that there are a series of fragmentations and within the EU, which is not new either, but also within the US. And that the US, for example, if we think about, we also did present the whole literature from a perspective. The interesting thing of our articles is the perspective of law, which Anna is like introducing, and my own perspective is more on political science. So we look at the literature from different viewpoints, and she also analyzes the type of extraterritorial sanctions and the countermeasures that the EU had in the case of Cuba, for example, but not in the case of Venezuela. So the US is imposing the same type of sanctions in Cuba and Venezuela, and the EU is only responding to Cuba. That's the main contradiction in the EU policy. You know, if you think about also, if you compare Venezuela, which we know quite well, although it's a long while ago that we haven't been there because of the situation. And we also look at Cuba. So there's a kind of comparison in this article also. And our conclusion is, when we look at the literature also of sanctions, then the sanctions work better when they are UN-centered and multilateral and not unilaterally imposed, because this also means that Venezuela, you have been written about that, Benedicte, also know about the sanctions and the negative effects of sanctions, in the sense of the political argument that you have the perfect external enemy. That's political argument, and then why they don't work, either selective or general sanctions. And then you have this economic argument, which you've been written on, Benedicte, that it also tends to, if we look at Venezuela, the main partner of Maduro, and the main strength of Maduro is the external support of China, and particularly Russia, right? So you have kind of criminalization of the informalization of the Venezuelan economy, and sanctions are completely counterproductive in this case, because they don't work if you want to impose a type of regime change. Regime change by sanctions is not working. I can't remember any example. Maybe South Africa, the apartheid regime, but it was a completely different case, and many governments imposed sanctions. And in this case, it's mainly the EU and the US, and this is not working. So there are several other conclusions in our article, but we found it interesting to look at both perspectives. The US sanctions, which are seen very critically, obviously, but the EU tends also to be an actor with a lot of coercive policies. No? The EU imposes sanctions against 33 countries, the same as the US. And we always look at the EU like a normative, nice, soft power actor, but it isn't. It has also this kind of imposition of democracy on other states, particularly those states which are not like China, very big states, but small, little, no. So it's a kind of contradiction also. That's what we try to do in our article.
Thank you very much. I think we're going to get back to sanctions in the discussion. But I would like to leave the word to José Manuel. I think you've written the most depressing article I've read in 2020, and that says a lot about the economy, this kind of the detailing the economic collapse of Venezuela. Please.
Thank you, Benedicte. And it's really nice to be here. And thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity to present this small contribution to the debate about Venezuela in front of very good friends. Thank you for the invitation for the Center for the Latin American Studies of Pittsburgh University, for America Latina Hoy, the University of Salamanca, and the people behind those institutions, Francisco, María Ángeles, and you, Benedicte, for being here with us. You know, I'm an economist. I'm better than 1,000 words, one number. For that reason, I'm going to use 4 slides just to give you an overview of what we did in this paper, what are the main findings of this paper that I wrote with Jesus Rodriguez, a colleague who is in the University of Warwick. Yes, very depressing indeed, the results, unfortunately. The title of this article is Venezuela in the Stage of Macroeconomic Collapse, a Historical and Comparative Analysis. What we did in this, as you know, Venezuela in the last 7 years has been under a terrible economic crisis. The GDP per capita, unfortunately, the central bank just published the last year that the Venezuelan central bank published data was 2018. And we did an econometric work with data between 1950 to 2019. But at the end, I'm going to present some estimation and projection from IMF to give you the whole period until 2020. But what we can see is that for the end of 2018, the GDP per capita is the lowest in the history of the Venezuelan economy. Basically, between 2014 and 2018, Venezuela lost 47% of the total GDP. Basically, 47% of the GDP disappeared as a consequence of a deep economic recession during 7 consecutive years. We wanted to understand what is the meaning of lose 47% in 5 years in the Venezuelan history and in the history of the world. And to try to find evidence for that question, we built 2 databases. The first one, data from the Venezuelan Central Bank from 1950 to 2018. And the second database that we built was an IMF data set for 196 countries. Using this data, the econometric package, the econometric program, we tried to identify the countries in the world that had 5 consecutive years of economic contraction like Venezuela. And here a couple of slides with the main results and findings. 47% decrease of GDP, without any doubt, is the worst macroeconomic performance of Venezuela in its history in the last 70 years. Venezuela never ever before had 5 consecutive years of economic contraction. That economic contraction is much stronger that Bolivia had during 81 and 86 during the hyperinflation in Bolivia, but it's even stronger than the economic contraction that has Nicaragua between 84 and 99 during also the hyperinflation. Conclusion, this is the strongest economic contraction in Venezuelan history, but it's also the strongest economic contraction in Latin American history for the last 40 years. In terms of the world, that 196 countries that we build data from the IMF. Certainly Ukraine, you know very well the story, during 92 to 1997 had a very complex situation, political and social, and that instability during those 5 years, the consequence of that was that Ukraine lost 49% of GDP. Sierra Leone, that was officially in a civil war, lost in between 1994 and 1999, 49% of the GDP. But Venezuela will be the third worst macroeconomic performance in 5 consecutive years in the story of the world in the last 40 years. That's is not a good record at all. But obviously, as I told you, we don't have official data for 2019 and 2020. But if we take the estimations, the projection of IMF of 2019, that the contraction of the economy was minus 35%, and in 2020, the estimation was minus 25%. That means that in the last 7 years, between 2014 and 2020, Venezuela lost 75% of the total GDP. I mean, after 7 years of economic contraction, we have just a quarter, the 25% of the total GDP we had in 2013. And obviously, the consequence of that in social terms has been depressing, amazing. Venezuela at the moment has 96% of the population living in poverty. At the moment, for the first time in the last 100 years, we have a minimum salary that is lower than Cuba and lower than Haiti. And the social impact of this economic crisis has been tremendous over the population. I mean, you can imagine how you can lose 75% of GDP in 7 years. And that was, I want to emphasize this point, consequence of the mismanagement of the economy. If you summarize the set of economic policy that was implemented during that period, you can see exchange control, price controls, interest controls, controls over the labor market, and expropriation and nationalizations. You had more than 300 companies that were expropriated, and they create, that cocktail of economic policy create a very negative environment for business and took the Venezuelan economy to the deepest economic contraction in history. And to finish with the idea, it's a terrible paradox, and it's a paradox of plenty in the idea of the Terrelling Carl. During 1999 and 2020, Venezuela received the biggest oil shock in history. During those 20 years, the total income of Venezuela was $1 trillion or $1 billion, 1 with 12 zeros. After that shock of $1 billion, one with 12 zeros, Venezuela is living or suffering the worst macroeconomic contraction in history, and probably the worst macroeconomic contraction in the world in the last 40 years. This was the main findings of the paper, and we can, in the discussion and debate and question, to be more details about what we did in the paper. Many thanks. I want to be respectful with the time, because Venezuelan we don't have very good, we're not very good on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, José Manuel. I will ask you some questions about the paper, and there's also some questions coming in here, but I would like to start the discussion by asking both of you, what would you highlight as the main finding of the overall special issue? I would just like to remind the audience that there's also a paper on the different dialogue mechanisms highlighting the issue of asymmetry between the parties. There is an interesting issue on the Venezuelan student movement as a part of civil society. There's a comparison between the kind of repression in Nicaragua and Venezuela that I also find very interesting. But what would you highlight as kind of the main contribution to the debate in Venezuela, and how can this have an impact on the debate, which is to call it politicized, I suppose, is an understatement.
Please go ahead.
That's a very difficult question, because I mean the articles are quite different, addressing different topics. So it's very difficult to find. I mean, maybe the multi-level crisis, or the economic, the social crisis, the political crisis, the external crisis, or the what you just said, the macroeconomic collapse, is like the uniting element. But two articles are looking at the students' movement using databases. I didn't know, because they are using a database which is has been made in Venezuela, and I think it's interesting also to look what is going on in Venezuela on special issues like the students' movement. And we don't know these databases, or that's also my experience with Cuba, that sometimes you have to go there to access some documents and some findings. But the main finding, it's a kind of negative scenario also coming out. And we just saw that the elections, the legislative elections, came out like a consolidation of the regime. So the scenarios are not too positive. No, what José Manuel has already said. And from my point, my main finding was maybe in the article you just mentioned from Martinez Meucci and Alfaro, because I've learned that all these mediation attempts, we had like 4 or 5 or 6 mediation attempts. The last one has been done by Norway. My understanding is that it still continues, but maybe not the situation is completely different, no? Because now the regime has the whole of institutions, Juan Guaido and the opposition appeared to be quite weak. And in this article by Martinez Meucci and Alfaro, I learned that they hadn't been successful because they underestimated the asymmetries between the parts, no? Because of the winning coalition in this sense is more the Maduro regime, no? So they underestimated, or they overestimated, the strength of the opposition, or the other way around. So that was an interesting lesson, and it's coming out now. I mean, it was a kind of prediction, no, by those two authors. The volume starts with the article I just mentioned. José Manuel.
Yes, no, I agree with you, Susan. I think this kind of issue where you have the opportunity to see one experience from different perspectives are very useful, especially for economists. I believe if you want to understand Venezuela, you have to see more than the economics of part of the problem. This crisis at the beginning was an economic crisis, but now is a social crisis, a humanitarian crisis, a migrant crisis, and I say that probably is a systemic crisis because everything is going in the wrong direction, and the crisis is deep and deep and deep, and generating the biggest exodus of population in Latin America. And I think that's the useful of the multidimensional perspective of this special issue about Venezuela, what we did in America Latina hoy.
Yeah, maybe the interdisciplinary approach, no? Because we have like a perspective from the sociology, from economics, from international relations, international law. There are only 5 articles, but many disciplines within a broad range of social sciences are represented, no? So maybe this is the special thing about the issue.
I've gotten quite a few questions about sanctions. I have some myself, and I've got some to both of you actually. I'll just run a number of questions past you, and you can pick the ones that you would like to answer. José Manuel, I think you show extremely clear that this crisis did not start in 2017 when the main sanctions started, that this has a long history and the crisis started long before. But I was still a bit intrigued why you didn't mention the issue of sanctions at all, because there is there is a debate about exactly what kind of effect has it had on exacerbating many aspects of the crisis. So I would just like to start out this discussion with that question to you. Did you contemplate that? Was that conscious to totally leave it out, or did you have any other reasons?
No, that's a good point, without any doubt. And if you want to be totally honest, you have to accept that the sanctions, they had an impact over the economy. They deepen, exacerbate the economic crisis. But they are not the origin of the economic crisis. The origin of the economic crisis, indeed, the first year that the Venezuelan economy had an economic contraction was 2014. In 2014, the oil prices were 98. The oil basket, Venezuelan oil basket, was $98. The oil prices were very high. We didn't have any sanctions in 2014, and the coronavirus wasn't there at that time. Conclusion, the origin of the problem is consequence of the mismanagement, clientelism, corruption, and the wrong cocktail of economic policy. As I mentioned before, exchange control, interest rates control, labor market controls, expropriation and nationalization. The expropriation make a terrible damage to the foreign direct investment. At the moment, Venezuela is the country in the continent with the lowest level of foreign direct investment. And we don't have the gasoline to have an economic growth like many other countries in Latin America, like Peru, because we don't have the capital flows that allow us to do that. Conclusion, sanctions deepen and are important explaining in the last 2 or 3 years the bad performance of the Venezuelan economy. But the origin of the problem is a totally different one.
Thanks. I'm going to continue to ask you some of the questions that came in about kind of the possible ways out of this economic crisis, and also in a comparative perspective, but also some of the policies. But Susanne, there's many aspects of this kind of comparison that I would like to ask you. I've got a question from the audience asking what is the real foundation of that? Is that essentially because there's a different constituency in Europe? Is it about the differences in goals of the two set of sanctions? They are of course very different, the kind of means that they're proposed. But the main question that I would like to ask you is that can we think of you concluded that all of them, although they're different, they're inefficient, they're not working as is the stated goal. But is it possible to think of a way that sanctions could be productive, or do you think that sanctions are by definition not a good way to go about this?
We have many types of sanctions. We try to do a kind of typology of sanctions, in our article, based on the literature. But if you look at South Africa, as I said, that was a real successful case against the apartheid regime, in the 90s. That was successful. But there are few examples. If you look at the literature, most of them are kind of not being productive either, or sometimes in the middle. But it depends. You have to distinguish. The motivation is very important. What do you try to do with the sanctions? And what we find out in our text that most of the cases which are involving like regime change as an objective, it's more the domestic constituencies. Different constituencies. In the US, it's more the Venezuelan immigrants, the immigration, also the maybe related to, if we think about Trump, he's still there. Trump was looking at Cuba and Venezuela in the same way, the same type of communist regime, and the EU, in a sense, they distinguish between both cases, because the The EU has always had like a dialogue with the Castro regime in the past, no? And they really never imposed sanctions. They imposed a common position, but it's not like this type of sanctions, because the regimes are very different also. No? I think they can work, but not as an imposition of democracy. I think that's really not possible in a closed authoritarian regime. If you have a big winning coalition, or if you have like the big opposition, which is very powerful, a hybrid regime, a democratic regime, then sanctions maybe make more sense, no? Or maybe they could work, but only at the UN level if many, many countries follow those sanctions, which is not the case in Venezuela. No? There are too many contradictions.
To follow that a little bit, what's your explanation? What kind of your explanation for the different attitude towards, or the different means imposed to Cuba and on Cuba and on Venezuela by the European Union? Why did they choose a very different approach in the Venezuela case?
Yeah, that was since we started to compare a little bit both cases. We wrote another article in Spanish with Ana Ayuso too, and our explanation is that very simple. They are inverse transitions. No? There's a democratic transition, or kind of not democratic transition, but something is going on in Cuba. No, there's an opening, an economic opening. The regime is very different. It's not a fragile state at all. No, it's an authoritarian state. For sure, but it's not a fragile state, no? As Venezuela is becoming a fragile state. So there are different situations, and the EU, its main interlocutor or its main partner has always been the Cuban regime. And in the other case, Chavez, yes, wonderful relations, complete nice relations, never had any type of problem, only a series of declarations under Chavez. But then the Maduro regime is becoming more and more authoritarian, and they are going the other way. No, they're coming from a liberal democracy. They are going through worse and worse to a dictatorship. No, you could, I mean, the last elections, fraudulent elections, it's not going the other way around. So maybe this might be an explanation, although politics is never as rational as academics think, no? So maybe it's just a coincidence that different lobbies are doing other different things, domestic constituency, or the role of the European Parliament, which was really the key actor when they started to impose sanctions on Venezuela. It was not member states, it was the European Parliament.
Just a brief comment to complement the comment of Susan. And we have to be totally honest. The US and the European Union implemented many sanctions to try to break the government coalition and try to build the condition for a political transition. And that didn't happen. The point is that despite, it doesn't matter if you agree or disagree with the sanction. The sanctions are not effective, creating the condition for a political transition. And Venezuela and Cuba and Korea and many countries in Africa are very good example of that. Sanctions for itself cannot make create the condition for a political transition, and that's very clear in the case of Venezuela.
Yeah, that's also because at the very beginning, when Juan Guaido proclaimed himself president, then the US, there was this threat of a military intervention. So if you have or a military intervention, a kind of threat, or if you're doing a mediation, an effective mediation, but none of the two complementary measures have been taken, neither by the US nor by the European Union, because they are not mediators. Norway is a mediator, not the European Union. They made up a group of international contact, but the role of this group is not the mediation. They are both, the US and the EU can't mediate, not even under Biden, I would say. But maybe it's going too far. So.
I'd like to return to that, but I would just like to go a little bit more into the economic situation first, and sort of to try to force you to be a bit optimistic, or at least think about kind of a way out of this. in your international cooperation and also your not cooperation, comparison, sorry, and also the comparison with other cases in history, I mean, most of those crises have been solved in some way or another. So my question is to you, how have you looked at how the crisis, the economic crisis, were solved? And I would also like to bring in a question from the audience, which is that sort of what kind of policies can we expect from the government, economic policy from the government in the months to come? I mean, there's some legal changes that allow them now to actually implement new policies faster. Do you see them generating in any kind of ways economic growth, some sort of recovery?
To be totally honest, I don't see any change at all in economic policy with a Chavista government, with the revolution. Nicolás Maduro doesn't have any credibility to find the aid and help from IMF and World Bank and to receive the amount of money that you need to implement in a successful way a stabilization program. I believe that Nicolás Maduro, he cannot do it. The only possibility that we have as a society is build a political change, a political transition, elect a new government. If you see all the opinion polls, the support of Nicolás Maduro is no more than 10 or 12% of the population. 85, 90% of the population wants a political change. If we can create the right context for a political transition, we can elect a new president who can have the power to implement economic policy in 3 stages. What are these 3 stages? The first stage is social, a program of emergency with direct subsidized to the 50 or 60% of the population to help them to survive this emergency. So direct subsidized for food and medicine. After that emergency program, you have to implement a stabilization program. You have to implement economic policy in fiscal, monetary, and exchange rate policy to stabilize the economy, recover growth, control over the inflation. And after that, you can go to a third stage of the reforms. That is diversify the economy. Venezuela at the moment is still 96% of the total export are only oil. We have to diversify the economy and have 3 or 4 or 5 engines that can complement oil to have a better future. Only with oil, and Norway knows that very well, is not enough to build a stable economy for the future and a better life for the Venezuelans. But we have to implement in a sequence and of economic policy in 3 different stages: the emergency social program, the stabilization program, and the diversification program at the 3rd stage of that economic policy that we have to implement.
But I mean, the open question is who could impose or who can impose this transition agenda? There's the opposition is quite weak at the moment because they boycotted these legislative elections. They are not dominating in any institution. Part of them are living outside, if we think about Leopoldo Lopez. So the transition roadmap is quite clear because we are now discussing it like for 2 years, or not the academics, but politicians. But how can that happen? I mean, I think maybe it's because of the late hour now in Europe, because I'm much more pessimistic. I don't think that this will happen 2 years after. I remember that we wrote in our Foreign Affairs Latin America article that one of the scenarios is the consolidation of Maduro, and they wanted to eliminate that part, and that's what exactly is happening now. So maybe the solution would be also to think about other external actors, what to do with China, what to do with Cuba, because Cuba is also exporting their own revolution. Cuba is also like an autocracy promoter, as well as not maybe China, but Russia would be very important to include in this negotiation process, because if not, they always have this alternative. What would happen at the economic front without China and Russia? I don't know. Maybe then the only solution or the only scenarios I see is all the consolidation of authoritarianism in midst of this humanitarian all over crisis, or a social upheaval. I can't think about another scenario right now. Maybe you see something different, because I'm not in Venezuela, I'm in Spain.
Susan, you are right. Without political change, there is not any possibility of economic change. And with the result of the last Sunday, that political transition is going to take even longer than before, unfortunately. And that's the reality.
I would like to go a little bit more into that, but I would just like to bring in one comment from one of the other authors of the articles in the journal, and I will just read the whole thing. And she answers the question that I asked to you in the beginning. She writes that it's María Pilar Garcia Guadilla that has written on the student movement. Don't you think that this issue shows the failure of the utopia of the socialism of the 21st century, or the Chavista project of participatory democracy, and the emergence of authoritarianism as a way to maintain power when the oil extractivism model enter into a crisis? What's your comment to that?
Susan.
Now, because of the socialism of the 21st century, I think this was a kind of invention originally from Heinz Dietrich, a German author. I met him several times in Cuba, and he was like trying to establish a new type of regime. But this was under Chavez. I think now we are in a completely different moment, no? Post-Chavism can't be compared. It's not even populism, it's authoritarianism. So the transition was the other way around towards, yes, as Maria Pilar says, authoritarian regime. And I think it was rather populism than socialism of the 21st century. Yes, I think there's not much new about this concept of you can't sustain that. I think it worked under Chavez because of his charisma, of his leadership or whatever, but now it's done. I mean, nothing that has been left. No, at the beginning, participatory democracy, we have seen that in other countries, in Ecuador, in other countries. And it was more about populism, except from maybe Bolivia. Bolivia is a completely different story.
Yeah, I think that a socialist government is just a label. I don't see in the last 20 years a real socialist experiment or program. What I can see is a very populist experiment that exacerbated the worst of the rentier model of the last 40 years. I don't see anything new, just the exacerbation of the rentier model of the last 40 years. The worst of the Cuarta República is in the what Hugo Chavez implemented in the last 20 years with Nicolás Maduro.
I would like to we have to start thinking of rounding this up, but to move a little bit into the kind of the future. The overall findings of or conclusions in the special issue are, of course, a bit bleak, both in terms of the prospects of dialogue, considering the asymmetries that have just been expanded since the last round of dialogues last year. The sanctions, you conclude that they're basically useless. What kind of role would you see for the different actors in the time to come after the new National Assembly is installed the 5th of January? There will be some changes in the US. Do you see some openings for some kind of international cooperation with domestic actors to find some kind of solution? Nonetheless, 5 minutes on that. Who wants to start?
I believe that question is for Susan.
Okay. Yeah, I think the time for dialogue has gone, no? For the moment, I don't see any dialogues. There was a dialogue between the regime and those official opposition parties that participated in the legislative elections. But now I don't see the moment for a negotiation. But the only important change maybe is the new US government, and maybe there's more, hopefully there's more dialogue also with other actors, maybe China. Maybe China would be important to address in this question, because I saw a declaration also by the Chinese government very similar to what the EU is saying. So maybe there's ground for a type of cooperation, maybe not between Russia and the US, because it's kind of Cold War dynamics, no? Going on in Venezuela. But maybe China would be interesting to include. But this is more international perspective. You are living in Venezuela, so maybe you see a completely different scenario than myself.
José Manuel, all crises like this in history have ended. Well,
yeah,
not well necessarily, but there has been some changes. What do you see happening in the months to come?
Well, I still believe that we can rebuild the country, but it's not going to be soon. Unfortunately, if you see all the forecasts from IMF, World Bank, and many other institutions, all of them believe that Venezuela is going to have the 8th consecutive year of economic contraction in 2021. And the process of hyperinflation, I didn't talk about that. Venezuela at the moment is the only country in the world in hyperinflation. The hyperinflation have 4 years and probably is going to continue in 2021. That means we are going probably to break the record of Nicaragua with the longest hyperinflation in the world. Conclusion, I believe Venezuela still have the possibility to rebuild the economy and the country, but we have to be patient, and probably we are going to have 1 year more of economic crisis, hyperinflation, and economic contraction, unfortunately.
And I know you're not a political scientist, but what do you think? What do you see happening on the political side in order to change the situation?
No, that's a very good question. I'm not a political scientist, but even economists, we are not very clever. We understand that without political change, it's impossible to make an economic change, and we have to build that transition, and we have to do it. Transition as the only possibility that Venezuela has to rebuild the country and implement this stabilization program that I talked that must have 3 different stages. The first one, the social emergency programs, direct subsidies for the 50 to 60% poorest of the population, then the stabilization program, and then the structural change to diversify the economy. But the first step is to create the political transition, and that's something that is at the moment very difficult, because after the result of this last Sunday, where Nicolas Maduro took control over the National Assembly, that political transition is going to be more difficult, it's going to take more time, unfortunately.
We have 1 minute left, so I would like to use that to just ask you a bit of a meta question before we just we round off, and that is, when you sit and work on these academic papers, what kind of what hopes do you have for this becoming a part of the political debate? I mean, the political scientists have written about the risks of this sort of creeping authoritarianism for many years. It hasn't really changed anything. The economists have done the same, and other people have written about the need for kind of a different debate and new concepts to find common grounds between the different groups we have. But what kind of, you that still work and live most of the time in Venezuela, what kind of impact do you see that these academic articles have on the debate? Is it useful? Is it mainly for the history, or is there a point in all of this?
No, I hope that this kind of debates and publications like America Latina Hoy can have influence over the political elite. But one of the problems that at the moment we have a very polarized society. At the moment, the opposition have 3 or 4 different leaderships. The opposition have 3 or 4 different strategies, and we have a serious collective action problems. If we don't find a solution for those collective action problems, it's impossible to win an election against the Chavismo, because Chavismo is a minority, just 10 or 15% of the population, but they are together. The opposition is divided between, as I said, 3 or 4 different leaders and between 3 or 4 different strategies. I hope this kind of debates and articles can shape in the right direction the political class. But we have serious problem of collective action among our politicians. And that's the main problem now.
Susanne, I will just give you the final word and toss in a couple of more comments from the audience. And that is that sort of in the debate, it tends to be one of the sides, it's the criticism that we have mainly represented one of the sides in the conflict. And do you think that as academics from abroad are mainly contributing to kind of reproducing the polarization, or can we also have a different role in this debate?
Yes, I think we shouldn't reproduce this kind of polarization, and contribute also. It's not only, I mean, to write for these peer-reviewed journals. It's also our mission to maybe contribute to political solutions in a sense, no? And to analyze why things are not working out. As I said, the mediation effects. There, this article, the first article of the special issue, is very interesting to look at. And also this kind of double blockade. No, we have a blockade, an internal blockade. We have also an external blockade. No, as I said, no, there's polarization also between the US, the EU, Canada, the Western countries, and the non-Western countries. Democracy and autocracy promotion. There are different things going on in Venezuela. It's like a battlefield for different types of problems and conflicts, no? And it makes it so interesting from an academic perspective, but it's a kind of tragedy for those people that live in Venezuela, no? And I think it's also our duty as academics to contribute to those political solutions, to create bridges between different parts, and to suggest what can be done. I mean, I don't have the bola de cristal, no, the solution to the problem, but we should also think that we have a public message to bring over, not only to write for our academic colleagues. No, that's what I think should be done also in this type of special issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Comment that maybe help to understand what is a systemic crisis. The internet company that I'm using, that was one of the companies that was expropriated at the beginning of Hugo Chavez's government. That's the reason why we have probably the slowest internet in Latin America. And that's the reason why I have problems to have communication with you. Just a specific example, how they destroyed the country and the telecommunication infrastructure Venezuela had.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you. And I would encourage the whole audience to read this special issue, of course, and apologize, because now towards the end here, the Q&A section is on fire, and I was only able to bring in a very few of them. But thank you so much for a really interesting conversation, José Manuel and Susana and Marianne.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks to you, Benedicte.
And if I may, just reiterate our thanks and appreciation for all your participation and the brilliant conversation. I really do wish we'd gone further. As Benedicte says, I mean, the questions are just going up, and it's just getting ever more interesting. Thank you.